Good morning, family. It is again Leontini with Black History 365 Days a Year. Today, I want to share some information about Black history, some things that you may know, but also to give you maybe some advice and some encouragement to go out and to do some things this weekend or during some time that you have off. Now, if you're a government worker, and I'm a government worker on top of doing my own business and lectures and books, out here you got to work multiple jobs just to keep the water bill paid, the light bill paid, and everything else. But one of the perks is that we actually get President's Day. And President's Day is Monday, so we will have Monday off, those of us who work in certain industries. If you work for the federal government, post office, government workers, we do celebrate President's Day. But instead of you going out and, buying some stuff, I'm not saying that you can't go out shopping. Lord knows I would never suggest that. But you might want to consider learning more about our presidents. And if you live in Central Virginia or even in Northern Virginia, we have the presidential homes. All of them, from Mount Vernon to Montpelier to Monticello, and even our nation's capital, they were all built by the labor of enslaved persons. And that's important to know. I know when I was a child growing up, that was never, mentioned in our history books. It just kind of seemed like miraculously those buildings were built and implied that they were built by Europeans or not slavery, but they were all built, in fact, by enslaved laborers. So the first one, and again, I always want to combine the history. African American Black history is the history for everyone. It's not just for a certain group. So the first person that we'll talk about is George Washington's Mount Vernon. I've been to Mount Vernon, and it's a good place to visit. But in terms of the enslaved community, it was built and sustained and maintained by the enslaved laborers there. And what's kind of funny, and I know that you might agree with me, maybe it's not funny, I just think it's kind of interesting, that you rarely meet someone with the last name of Washington who isn't Black. I have Washington surnames in my family. I'm sure that many of you do, but most people who have that surname are African Black Americans, and that's not by accident when you had hundreds of slaves and after they were emancipated took on this surname of Washington. And not only the surname, but several of people in our community, in the African American Black community, are also biological descendants of the Washington family. So you want to do your research. I know there are people out there who I know who are actually descendants of Washington. Now, here's a book that I would recommend that you read. Again, there are hundreds of books, if not thousands of books, written on the subjects of our presidents. But I try to keep the books that are relevant and related to the African American community. So here's one. This was written by a local historian and scholar, Henry Winsick. And this is about George Washington, an imperfect God, his slaves, and the creation of America. So this is a book that I would suggest that you read. Our next president for President's Day would be Abraham Lincoln. I remember my grandfather, Solomon Gator, my mother's father, talking about Abraham Lincoln and how he freed the slaves. And we know now that if the Union could have been preserved and kept people enslaved, they would have kept us enslaved. That's why we keep having all these issues of racism and white supremacy, because people haven't moved very far off the mark. So we attribute the freeing of the slaves to President Lincoln, and it was a calculated strategy to preserve the Union by emancipating the slaves. So go do your research on Abraham Lincoln. And there are a lot of institutions that are named for Lincoln, and President's Day is one that we want to honor him and the legacy of freedom for all people in this nation. My grandfather, Solomon, like many of his contemporaries, became Republicans because of Abraham Lincoln. Most African Americans, black people, are Democrats, but during that season of time, they were Republicans. And then here's the influence of my cousin, Henry Clay, who ran for president a few times, but was never elected, but was, a very influential leader in our country, and the influence that he had upon Abraham Lincoln. Henry Clay his family was originally from Virginia, but he moved and made his mark in Kentucky. And of course, Abraham Lincoln also had ties to Kentucky, West Virginia, and Illinois. And perhaps my favorite president, not because my family was part of the community, of the enslaved communities in and around Montpelier and Orange County, Madison County, would be President James Madison, because, of course, he's known as the father of the Constitution. But I've done research and reading on President James Madison, and really he was, from childhood, a brilliant individual. And I say to people all the time, he had, because of the time, of course, that he was born, because of the enslaved workers, he was able to get a quality education, dedicate his time. He spoke several languages, could read several languages, and really was a dedicated scholar and dedicated to building a better America. And of course, this would have been for the landed gentry America, so for the Europeans, not for the enslaved people. But we still have to give him credit for his scholarship, for his dedication and commitment to writing the Constitution, which still stands. Hopefully, those things in the Constitution can help us to remove the person who is at 1600. I don't think that James Madison or any of the founding fathers intended for the type of leadership. This is just my personal opinion from what I observe. I'm a voting citizen, and I can express my opinion that currently occupies 1600. So I would also want to share a little bit of bias here, because I am part of the enslaved community from my ancestors being at Montpelier and in Madison County. This is on my father's side. So I really encourage you to visit all of the presidential mansions during this season of time, either tomorrow or the weekend on Monday, which is President's Day, or sometime in the near future, because they have done an excellent job, I know, at Montpelier and at Monticello, an excellent job of presenting a holistic story about the enslaved communities, their ancestors, the descendants, and telling the true American story, not just about the people that the presidents and their families, but the entire family. So a lot has changed over the past few years in terms of interpretation, archaeological finds, and family history. So definitely encourage you to visit Monticello, Montpelier, Mount Vernon. And here's one of the individuals, who was at Montpelier, was Paul Jennings, who got his freedom and who was the manservant of President James Madison, and he was with him when he died. Paul Jennings wrote the book, his memoirs, and I believe it was the first one that was published, that type of book published during the time. And so I would recommend also Paul Jennings' book, A Slave in the White House with the Madisons. So this is an excellent read about Paul Jennings. And again, I'm going to also plug The Mere Distinction of Color, which is the exhibit, an award-winning exhibit at Montpelier. When you go to Montpelier, you not only can visit the mansion, but you can visit the Gilmore cabin, which was a cabin that was occupied by a former enslaved family at Montpelier, and they went on and built their own home just really across the highway. And it's really a place that I would encourage you to visit, as well as the segregated train station. Then, if you feel so inclined, you could also participate in Montpelier's Archaeology Expedition Program, which I've participated in a couple of times, and here's our picture from there. So I'm not shameful about that, because I think it's a great opportunity to learn about the descendants, but also a lot about yourself. You never know, you might be one of those descendants. And last but certainly not least is President Thomas Jefferson of Monticello. I live just a couple of minutes from Monticello. They have done an extraordinary job in telling the story of the enslaved communities there. Many of you are familiar with Sally Hemings and the Hemings family of Monticello. I would recommend Annette Gordon Reed's book, The Hemings of Monticello, as a first book to read to get a greater understanding of really some of the things that went on during that period of time. And then some people would say more controversial, I just say it opens up another depth of understanding, is Master of the Mountain. And this is Thomas Jefferson and his slaves. So those are the ones that I recommend today. This video has been a little long because I wanted to share as much information as possible. You go out and have a great weekend. Stay warm. Have a safe weekend. And I will see you tomorrow. Well, if we click off, I'll see you tomorrow.